One night, I was on a long bus ride home after visiting some friends. It was late, and the bus was mostly empty, with just a few passengers scattered across the seats. The driver, an older man with a grizzled beard, seemed friendly enough. He would occasionally glance at me through the rearview mirror, giving a reassuring smile that made me feel a bit more at ease during the quiet ride. We were about halfway through the trip when I noticed something strange. The bus suddenly veered off the main road and took a detour. The route was unfamiliar, and the further we drove, the darker and more isolated the streets became. I couldn't help but feel uneasy as the buildings thinned out, replaced by empty lots and overgrown fields. Trying to shake off the creeping anxiety, I approached the driver, asking if we were still on the right route. He just smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and said he was taking a shortcut. His tone was casual, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. I returned to my seat, glancing at the other passengers. They, too, seemed to be growing nervous, exchanging uneasy glances and whispering among themselves. The atmosphere on the bus had shifted, and the sense of unease was palpable. As we continued on this unfamiliar path, the bus stopped at a red light. In the eerie silence, I realized something deeply unsettling. There were no other cars on the road. No pedestrians, no streetlights, nothing. It was as if we had entered a void, with only the bus, the driver, and the handful of passengers. My heart began to race, a primal instinct telling me that something was very wrong. Then, the lights inside the bus flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the seats. When I looked at the driver again, his face seemed different. His once friendly eyes had turned cold, and his smile had twisted into something sinister, something almost inhuman. It was as if the man who had started the journey was no longer behind the wheel. Panic surged through me, and I quickly moved back to my seat, my pulse hammering in my ears. The bus eventually found its way back to the main road, but the tension was unbearable. The other passengers were silent, their faces pale, as if they too had sensed the change in the driver. When my stop finally approached, I practically jumped out of my seat, desperate to get off the bus. As I stepped onto the pavement, I made the mistake of looking back. The driver was staring at me, his face twisted into a grotesque expression that still haunts me to this day. His eyes followed me as the bus pulled away, and I could feel his gaze lingering long after he had disappeared into the night. Shaken, I tried to make sense of what had happened. But when I later contacted the bus company, they told me something that sent a fresh wave of fear through me. There was no record of that driver working that night. No one could explain who he was or where he had taken us during that mysterious detour. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was behind the wheel that night wasn't of this world. It was late, around 11 p.m., and the city bus was almost empty, the day's hustle and bustle giving way to the quiet stillness of the night. After a long day at work, I was exhausted, counting down the minutes until I could finally collapse into bed. There were only a few passengers left, scattered throughout the bus, each lost in their own world. The driver looked just as worn out as the rest of us, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, barely acknowledging our presence. I was sitting near the middle of the bus, my thoughts drifting as I stared out the window at the passing city lights. That's when I noticed him. At the back of the bus, a man in a dark hoodie had boarded at the last stop. He sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, his face obscured by the hood. He didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't make a sound. There was something unsettling about him, a sense of unease that gnawed at the edges of my tired mind. But I brushed it off, convincing myself that it was just my imagination, maybe the fatigue playing tricks on me. The bus continued on its route, and one by one the other passengers got off at their stops. The city seemed to grow quieter, the streets emptier, until it was just me and the man in the hoodie. The silence between us felt heavy, almost oppressive. I could feel my heartbeat quicken, though I tried to ignore the anxiety bubbling up inside me. Finally, the bus pulled up to my stop. I stood up, eager to leave and shake off the unease that had settled over me. As I reached the door, I hesitated and glanced back toward the rear of the bus. He was gone. Panic surged through me. There was no way he could have left without me noticing. I had been sitting close enough that I would have seen him walk past. But the back of the bus was completely empty, as if he had never been there at all. Yet the air felt cold, like a presence still lingered, watching me from the shadows. I hurried off the bus, my heart pounding in my chest. The streets were deserted, the city now a ghost town under the dim streetlights. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that hooded figure following me, but there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the city at night. I've taken that bus route many times since, but every time, late at night. I can't shake the feeling that he's still there, waiting at the back, hidden in the shadows, ready to vanish the moment I turn away. And every time, I find myself glancing back, just to be sure. But the bus is always empty. Still, I can't help but wonder if he's out there riding the bus, searching for the next unsuspecting passenger to notice him before he disappears again. After a grueling day at work, I found myself on a late-night bus, heading home on a route I had never taken before. Exhausted and ready to collapse into bed, I barely paid attention as the bus took an unfamiliar turn. I assumed it was just a detour, nothing to worry about. But as the minutes ticked by, I began to notice the scenery outside the windows. The city lights had faded, replaced by dilapidated buildings and shadowy streets. There were no street lights, just an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. Unease began to creep into my tired mind. Something about this didn't feel right. I leaned forward and asked the driver if we were still on the right route. He didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as if he hadn't heard me. I glanced around at the other passengers, hoping for some sign of recognition or concern, but they remained eerily calm, their faces blank and expressionless. The bus plunged deeper into the darkened streets, further and further away from any sign of life. The buildings became more decrepit, the streets more desolate. My anxiety turned to outright fear as I realized we were in a part of town I didn't recognize, one that seemed more like a forgotten relic than a living neighborhood. I decided it was time to get off. I pulled the cord, signaling for the next stop, but the bus didn't slow down. My heart began to race. I pulled the cord again, more urgently this time, but still, nothing happened. I looked around, panic rising in my chest, but the other passengers just stared straight ahead, their eyes vacant and unseeing. The bus continued on, driving into what felt like an endless night. It dawned on me then that this wasn't a normal bus ride. The people around me weren't passengers. They were something else, something not of this world. The realization hit me like a cold wave, and I felt a chill run down my spine. In a desperate bid to escape, I stood up and shouted at the driver, demanding to be let off the bus. Finally, he glanced back at me, his eyes devoid of any warmth or humanity. Without a word, he pulled the bus over to the side of the road, the doors creaking open with a metallic groan. I stumbled out into the darkness, my legs shaky with fear. The moment my feet touched the ground, the bus doors slammed shut and it sped off, disappearing into the blackness as if it had never been there at all. I stood alone on the empty street, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The silence was deafening, the kind that presses down on you like a weight. I had no idea where I was or how I would find my way home. The streets were deserted, the buildings around me silent and lifeless. That night, I wandered until I found my way back to a part of the city I recognized, but I've never forgotten that ride. I never saw that bus again, nor did I ever hear of that route. But deep down, I know that whatever path that bus was on, it wasn't meant for the living. After a long, exhausting shift, I boarded the late-night bus, eager to get home and collapse into bed. The bus was nearly empty, just me and a couple of other passengers who looked just as tired as I felt. I settled into my seat, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. As we approached my stop, something strange happened. The bus suddenly came to a halt, but we weren't at the usual stop. Instead, we were in the middle of a quiet, deserted street. The kind of place where you wouldn't expect to see anyone, especially at this hour. The doors creaked open, but no one was there. I looked around, confused, wondering if I had somehow missed my stop. The driver called out, "This is the last stop." His voice was flat, almost mechanical. I exchanged puzzled looks with the other passengers, but no one moved. The driver called out again, this time with an edge of urgency, "This is the last stop." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. The street outside was eerily silent, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long under the flickering streetlights. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. But then, I felt an overwhelming compulsion to leave, as if staying on the bus any longer would be a terrible mistake. I stood up, glanced at the other passengers who remained motionless, and stepped off the bus. The moment my feet hit the pavement, the doors slammed shut behind me with a force that made me jump. The bus sped off into the night, disappearing around a corner before I could fully comprehend what had just happened. I found myself standing alone on the dark street, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The place was utterly deserted, the only sound the distant hum of the city far away. The streetlights above flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I reached for my phone to call a cab, but there was no signal. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't get a single bar. Panic started to set in as I realized I had no idea where I was or how to get home. After what felt like hours, I finally saw headlights approaching in the distance. I waved frantically, desperate for any way out of this unsettling place. The car slowed down, and I could see an older man behind the wheel, his face etched with concern. He rolled down the window and looked at me as if I were a ghost. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "This place is abandoned. No one's lived around here for years." His words sent a chill through me. I quickly explained about the bus, how it had stopped and let me off here. But as I spoke, the man shook his head, his expression growing more troubled. "There hasn't been a bus route through here in decades," he said, his voice firm. "This area's been closed off for years." A cold wave of dread washed over me as I realized the impossible nature of what had just happened. Whatever that bus was, it wasn't something I could easily explain or forget. I thanked the man, barely able to speak, and got into his car. As he drove me back to civilization, I couldn't stop glancing out the window, half expecting to see that bus again. Since that night, I've never taken a late-night bus. Something happened out there on that deserted street, something I don't think I'll ever fully understand. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the feeling of stepping off that bus and into a world where the ordinary had twisted into something deeply, disturbingly wrong.